Ben Rothwell's CLOAK finally returned to BKFC 30, since now he's out of the UFC and no longer has to wear promotionally sponsored gear, which, just by the way, he absolutely hated. The question that probably pops into all of our heads is, what significance does this CLOAK have for him? Well, the good news is he finally explained it. In this video, we're going to talk about the legend behind his CLOAK. Let's get right into it. First up, Ben Rothwell and his legendary CLOAK, meaning explained. Rothwell set a mark at the BKFC debut this month, steamrolling Bobo O'Bannon in just 19 seconds. The CLOAK that he had carried to the ring is more than just a piece of clothing. It enables Rothwell to enter a different mental state, which helps him to prepare and collect himself for what's about to go down. I've got things going on in my mind. How do I click into this? I have to visualize some pretty dark things, and I don't even want to talk about it because I don't want to freak people out, Rothwell stated on the MMA tour. He said that he goes to a pretty dark place in his imagination, and then he imagines what this person has done to him or to his family, and that's when he enters the mode, and in that moment, he considers himself to be one of the most dangerous people on the planet. Next up, a peek into the psychological aspect of it. We mean, psychologically speaking, it makes sense. The human mind is really good at associating things. It's a good idea to associate things such as a clothing item or a song or even a scent with a certain kind of mental state. Once that association is created, it is easier to recall that certain mental health through that item. If you've heard about Pavlov and his dog experiment, we're sure you know what we're talking about, and that's classical conditioning. Another thing that could be happening could be Rothwell using a defense mechanism called sublimation. It's one of the defense mechanisms that allows us to act out undesirable impulses by transforming them into more acceptable activities. For example, someone who has a lot of anger and rage might take up kickboxing as a strategy to let that anger out, but now since being aggressive towards someone in wrestling and boxing is considered acceptable, it's seen as more acceptable behavior. Interesting, isn't it? It feels like Rothwell is using that CLOAK to trigger a mental state which helps him harness that anger and rage and then express it. If we look into a more theoretical aspect of it, sublimation, according to Freud, is a sign of maturity that helps people to function normally and in socially acceptable ways, because ultimately that anger needs to go somewhere, so why not in a manner that isn't necessarily harming someone? Following up, here's how not wearing the CLOAK impacted Rothwell in the UFC. Rothwell wore the CLOAK when fighting in the UFC, but that was way before the company signed an apparel contract with Reebok back in 2015. The 40-year-old says he was able to put on a CLOAK in his first battle of the year, but after that he couldn't because he had to wear the requisite fight gear. While it may seem insignificant to some, Rothwell's lack of that clothing item had an impact on how he was as a fighter. When he and the CLOAK came back in 2015, Rothwell did it for Matt Mitrione. He said it wasn't quite there for Josh Barnett. They made me take the CLOAK off immediately before I came out, which effed with me a little bit. I had a great win over Josh, and right away in my interview, I was Ben, a joyful guy again. He said that he was only Ben Rothwell in the fights after that, and he wasn't the same person, at least in his head, who we all saw at BKFC 30, costing him a lot of money. He lost a number of fights that he should have won, and he said it still bothers him how he left the UFC. Not to mention a dive into why Rothwell left UFC. The fighter had a sneaking suspicion that his time with the UFC was nearing the end. After being handed a fight against Alexander Gustafsson back in May, which would be the final fight on his current contract, the 40-year-old heavyweight contacted the promoter to explore a possible extension. In those meetings, it became evident that even if Rothwell won the fight, he wouldn't be promised a future with the UFC after that. Rothwell said that he and his management just sat back and wondered that since it was the last fight in the agreement, what would really happen next? He stated during the MMA Hour he finally asked UFC how exactly they plan on proceeding. So he and his management went to the UFC and asked if they could sign something, because he had been seeing this same pattern when UFC let some of the big heavyweights go. They asked UFC when they were going to sign a contract, to which they replied with a "let us get back to you." From there, it was understood that they weren't really interested in re-signing from the contract. Rothwell didn't appreciate the uncertainty hanging over his career, especially since he knew he only had a limited amount of time left in the sport. This prompted a completely separate conversation with the UFC in which Rothwell requested his release from the organization after 13 years on their roster. Not to mention, Rothwell Rothwell found his worth and is happy about his BKFC deal. Even though Rothwell didn't have hard feelings towards the UFC, he confessed that his final couple of years there were challenging as he tried to keep his own personality with the enforcement of a uniform policy in the aftermath of a multi-year deal negotiated with Reebok. Thankfully, Rothwell immediately discovered his market value after receiving bids from pretty much everybody in combat sports. He eventually agreed to cross over to a bare-knuckle fight. It was a contract offer from BKFC. According to Rothwell, BKFC made the best offer, and it certainly piqued his interest. He believes that it's a good fit for him because he had been doing BKFC before MMA. It had been a part of his life and something his grandfather was definitely not doing legally. But for Rothwell, combat sports is something that runs in his family, so it is something he's genuinely looking forward to. He called it a better deal than UFC, at least for now. We mean, if he's a six-figure fighter and wins his next 3 fights, he'll be easily making 7 figures. It's an excellent deal. Lastly, Rothwell's keeping his options open. Rothwell also pointed out the fact that he cannot forecast his future beyond his 3-fight contract with BKFC. He didn't say he'll never participate in mixed martial arts again because there's always the possibility of another company calling in with an offer he can't refuse. That being said, Rothwell appears to be ready to make his BKFC debut this summer, and he's now concentrating fully on the bare-knuckle competition. All we know so far is that he's keeping his options open. And in other news, first up, Rothwell is delighted that BKFC doesn't have a heavyweight limit. The former UFC heavyweight contender and current bare-knuckle FC fighter is loving the new rule set that came with parting ways with the UFC to compete in bare-knuckle boxing. The regulations extend beyond what is seen in the ring on fight night. As a heavyweight, Rothwell seems to have no weight limit, which is great. He would have had to weigh less than 266 pounds to compete in the UFC, but those days are long gone, as he weighed in at 292 pounds for his debut earlier this month at BKFC 30, a match he won within 19 seconds. Up next, Aljamain Sterling tops hobbled TJ Dillashaw to retain UFC title. In the co-main fight of UFC 280 in Abu Dhabi, Sterling defeated former champion Dillashaw via TKO at 3:44 of the second round. Sterling retained his UFC bantamweight title despite the fact that some other factors were at play here, so Dillashaw's left shoulder popped out of his socket in the first round, which had to be relocated by coach Dwayne Ludwig in between rounds. Ouch! Wait, that's not even the worst part. To everybody's horror, it popped out again in the second round. Sterling used constant pressure, knocked Dillashaw down, and scored the TKO with huge punches and elbows from back control. Sterling said he did not know about Dillashaw's injury. Lastly, Paddy Pimblett is to face Jared Gordon in UFC pay-per-view debut. It was announced recently that popular English lightweight Paddy Pimblett will fight Jared Gordon at UFC 282. Since his last fight in July, Pimblett has been eyeing the UFC 282 date. The 27-year-old has previously battled in Las Vegas, but never in front of a crowd. Pimblett will face Gordon, who's a 34-year-old experienced fighter and has been fighting professionally since 2011. Well, that's it, folks. What are your thoughts on Rothwell and his legendary CLOAK? Do let us know in the comment section below. And hey, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. We'll see you in the next one.